Now this evening, we're very lucky to have Esther Miriam Wagner talking to us on Arabic letters in the prize paper collections from Tuscany to Alexandria to the Levant, because this is really a window on one particular year, a ship captured by British privateers in 1759, and the letters that were found on it, virtually untouched since that time. These prize collections are really extraordinary. There was a meeting about another one in Madrid a few years ago, because they remain untouched since that date, since they were archived in the 18th century. They contain business letters sent between merchants in many different languages, and also between clergy as well as merchants. So Esther, who is the executive director of the Wolf Institute, who's done a doctorate on Judeo-Arabic letters at Cambridge and has published articles on this extraordinary find, is going to speak to us about it tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you very much to all of you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think originally we had planned this for spring 2020 or thereabouts, so a few things happened in between, but finally, 2 years later, I'm very, very pleased to be here, to have some live audience and also to see quite a few people joining us online, which is really, really great. So I'll start this with a slight caveat. I'm very conscious that I'm speaking at the Royal Asiatic Society as part of a Levantine Heritage Foundation series, but much of the material that I will present on actually concerns matters in Egypt, or it originates in Egypt, but I was assured earlier that anything east of Malta is the Levant, so I'm very, very pleased about that. And of course, in the medieval and in the post-modern era, there's actually a very, very strong link between Egypt and the Levant, because during most times, for example, under the Tunisian stemming Fatimids, or under the Kurdish Ayyubids, or under the Mamluks or the Ottomans, Egypt was actually part of the same country as part of West Asia. So most of the things that I will mention and talk about today actually may be about Egypt or concern Egypt, but just hold as true for the Levant and for Western Asia. So I want to start with a map of the Mediterranean, and I mean, just talking to some of you here, I am quite familiar that for preaching to converted, taking roles to Athens, you will know about this, but I still think I would like to emphasize this here. In the medieval and in the early modern period, the Mediterranean, this area around this sea, was really one big continuum. So Sicily, for example, was part of the Tunisian kingdom, or Spain belonged to an empire that stretched all around the southern Mediterranean. Crete belonged to Andalusia in the 9th and 10th century. And we all know that, of course, Turkey was part of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Greek-speaking region. And in fact, of course, until the early 20th century, a lot of the coast, the Levantine coast and into Egypt, still had Greek-speaking communities. But nowadays, because of political alliances, there's a very, very strong perception of a separation between the European and Asian and North African parts of the Mediterranean. Very often when people think of the Middle East, they think about war, they think about corruption, terrorism, all these things come into people's minds. They think of broken political systems, for example, in Lebanon, of dysfunctional governments, of poverty. And of course, this all goes back to a very human trait, that we tend to see the world through the prism of our own time, through our own experiences. And because of this present time, it's very often difficult for people that I talk to imagine that the past was actually very, very different. That the Middle East was a really thriving place with a well-functioning economy, a place that was in the forefront of science, a place that had literature and arts, the pinnacle of literature and art, when much of Europe was actually in what we would perhaps call a cultural dark age. When Europe was in a similar situation than parts of the Middle East are now. If you think about, for example, the 30-year war, which cost up to a third of the population lives at the time, depending on region. And much of the separation now that we have between the European Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, has to do with religion. So we have Christianity in Europe and we have Islam in the Middle East, but until the 20th century, communities in the Eastern Mediterranean especially were a lot more heterodox. We had Muslims living in Greece, we had Christians, a lot of Christians living in the Levant and in Egypt. We had Jews and Christians living in Iraq. So before the 20th century, a lot of this was a really multi-religious, multi-ethnic societies where people of different Abrahamic faiths especially lived together, not without problems obviously, but without the problems that were quite common in Europe. There were no expulsions, there were no pogroms. We really have to remember that people lived together there for 1,300 years. A shared history that is, I think, not found anywhere in Europe really. So, and when we look at the situation on the ground in terms of diversity, language is actually a really good indicator. So in Europe, because of pre-nationalist thought and because of nationalist thought, we created a particular homogeneity of states. We created states that really followed the creed as one language, one religion, one nation. And this wasn't so much the case in the East. So if you look at this map here, which I brought, has parts of Turkey and Iraq because that's the focus of the person who made the map. But of course, much of it also holds true for sort of the areas more in the west. But you see that there are various different language families and many, many different languages spoken in very, very close proximities. You have all these very sort of different villages next to each other speaking completely different languages from completely different language families. This is a map as courtesy of Jeffrey Kahn, professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge. So this really, the linguistic map, I think here gives you a really, really good impression of what diversity, ethnic diversity and religious diversity would have been on the ground in the area. And I think this also should be a reminder for ourselves that what we've had in the last 2 centuries in Europe, or 3 centuries perhaps, is really not the natural order of things. It's not naturally the way how societies need to function. So the way, of course, then to explore this is to look into the past, especially in the Middle East. And how do we ideally learn from the past or about the past? We can learn from historiographical sources, so we can read the historians. But in the last 2 or 3 decades, I think historians have really turned to another source, and that's documents. So we are much, much more interested now in documentary history because it's free of biases, it's free of agendas. People who wrote documents typically didn't think that hundreds of years later someone would start reading their materials. So I'm always really, really aware of this, that when I read a letter, there's sort of very, very intimate secrets in them, and someone talks about adultery in the family or about a daughter being beaten by the husband. I always wonder what they would think if they knew that, you know, a few hundred years later I'm reading this secret and I'm sort of putting it down in an article. But that's something that always plays out a little bit in my mind. So this shift from historians, we all have heard the saying, of course, that history is written by the winner, to historical documents, of course, is also tied in with this whole deconstructivist approach to history. So we don't have this idea anymore, a lot of historians don't have this idea anymore that there is just one agreed version of history, but there are many, many different versions depending on the perspectives of the individuals experiencing it. So naturally, growing up in this environment in academia, I am very, very interested in documents, in letters, in registers, and what I really love about it is that it preserves voices that you don't normally hear about. So, for example, this is a letter from the Geniza collection. I'll tell you what the Geniza collection is for those of you who don't know in a few minutes. This is a letter from a Genueser collection where a teacher writes to a parent. And it says, "You should know, my master, my lord, that, and all sorts of pious blessings, that your son actually didn't break his writing tablet. The other boys in the class broke the writing tablet. Don't punish him, it wasn't his fault." So obviously you have a little boy here who's in a class, who's being bullied, he's probably a bit precocious, he knows things, the other boys bully him and break his writing tablet. It's almost like an American high school sort of nerd versus jock play out. But to learn about this 700 years later from a little note like this is really, really special. And it really shows how amazing it is to delve into these sources from the ground, into this history from below. So, I've mentioned the Genueser connection now. I'm very conscious, again, my talk is about the price papers, and I will get there in the end, but I'm also a Genueser scholar, and the Genueser is very close to my heart, and I had a conversation earlier where someone didn't know the Cairo Genueser, so I will use this opportunity to introduce this most amazing source. So what we call the Cairo Genueser are basically 350,000 pieces of writing that were found in a synagogue in Cairo, or in Old Cairo, for starter. And they were deposited there over the course of 1,000 years, basically 900 years, because according to Jewish belief, you can't throw anything away that contains the name of God. You can't throw it away, you can't burn it, you have to either ritually bury it or you have to store it. And this was one of the storerooms, and basically people over 900 years kept depositing layer upon layer of writing. This is what it looked like when it came out. Into this room, and then it was taken out at the end of the 19th century, basically 900 years of history. And you will see that the script, for those of you who know languages, the script looks Hebrew, but actually most of the sources would have been Arabic. They're written in Hebrew script, but it's actually the Arabic language written in Hebrew script, which we call today Arabic. And what I've been doing is I've been using the Genueser as a backdrop and as a sort of explanatory depository when I talk about the price papers. And that's because the collection I'm talking about, the Arabic price papers, is actually just 55 letters. They're very, very precious, and I'll talk about why they're so precious. But of course, because it's a relatively small corpus, it's really, really exciting to have other materials to bolster, sort of any claims I might make. So I will always compare them to these 350,000 fragments that we have in the Cairo Genueser. And now I'm coming to the price papers themselves. So the price papers are stored in the National Archives in Kew Garden. And they are really a very, very special source. I know some of you, Philip was already talking about them earlier. Some of you know about them. The reason why the price papers are in the National Archives is that in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century, the navies and also private ships in Britain competed over finding spoils of war in the various seas. So basically, it's state-sanctioned piracy. Navy ships and also private ships would go out onto the seas. They would detect enemy ships, so ships that were sailing under the flag of one of the countries that Britain was in war with, and they would then take over the ship, take the wares. But most importantly, whenever they did this, in order to prove that they had really legitimately taken enemy wares, they had to take all the papers that were found on the ship, and they had to log them with the Admiralty Court. And then there would be a price paper investigation. People would establish that the wares that had been confiscated were indeed enemy wares or not. And then they could either keep them, or in theory, if they weren't enemy wares, they would have to give them back. I don't think that happened very often. It's very difficult. I mean, in the materials I've seen, it's very, very difficult for people to claim back unjustified sort of seizure of cargo. So, the ships that were seized were most often, during those 300 years, Dutch ships, Spanish ships, French ships, and most of the price papers, and thousands and thousands of price papers, are written in Dutch, French, Spanish, or in other languages. And there are, again, an absolutely astounding source of knowledge, because there's all sorts of correspondence that can be found in the price papers, not just mercantile, but other materials as well, which really sort of tell you all about the social and mercantile activities at the time. So it's a really treasure trove. They have only been discovered in the last decades or so. They lay relatively forgotten in the National Archives until, with this sort of rise in documentary history, with this interest in history from below, people discovered them, and then it's really taken off in the last years. Dozens or maybe even hundreds of researchers have started to work on these price papers. And I think maybe 5 years ago, so perhaps 6 years ago, a conference was organized at the National Archives in Kew Gardens to call together researchers writing and researching on the price papers. And I was invited as a person from a related field. So because I work in Geniza and because I work on letters from roughly the same period, so 18th, 19th century from the Geniza, I was invited to go there and talk about my materials. And then something special happened to me. Basically, I was approached after my talk. It was very nice to see that I had a lot of really interesting questions and suggestions. This person called Dr. Thomas Truxas, he joined me and said, "Can I show you something? I've just found something." And then he showed me this picture here, and it was a bit like, when people went into the Tutankhamun chamber and found this amazing thing. I was like, my heart leapt, because there's really very little material that Arabists like me can work on from the time. And so I took a photo. I booked myself onto a train to London, and I went to the National Archives to check this out. So it was again this very serendipitous moment that led to me starting to work on this. And when I got there into the National Archives, I found out all sorts of things. For example, I found out that the ship they were on, which was called the Bartolomeo Prato, the captain of the ship was Luigi Gonzaga, and his ship had been intending to sail from Livorno towards Alexandria. And the year in which all these letters were found was 1759, as Philip mentioned. And of course, this is the year Britain became master of the world. So I thought that was actually quite an interesting year to research as well. So when I went to the archives, I basically found these bundles of letters. There were in total 55 letters and registers and all sorts of things. I think overall it's about 80 documents with I think 55 distinct letters. And as Philip said, they were really untouched when I arrived. Most of the envelopes were still sealed, so it was really exciting to have the librarian open these things for me. And then when they opened, you really had this glistening ink. You could see that the ink was sort of absolutely, perfect condition, pure. I've never seen anything like it. And then sort of started disintegrating, and I was a bit worried that they would take the materials away from me. But they, when they were open, they were an absolutely astonishing color. So most of the local letters looked like this. Others had been opened because of the inquiry. Obviously, there had been an inquiry at some point where people established these wares had been enemy wares, even though it was really contested because they weren't technically enemy wares. But the outcome of that wasn't recorded there. So this is what they look like when they're opened. The letters that we have there consist of two different kinds of correspondence. On the one hand, we have, as I said, merchant letters. There's a lot of a big trade network that deals in wool, in leather, in cotton, in flax, and coffee, but also other things like safflower, cochineal. So it's a beetle that produces the red dye, which was the main source of red dye at the time. Pewter, and the trade would go both ways. So wool would be shipped from Europe into Egypt and into Asia, and then safflower or leather or coffee would come back the other way. So the majority of the writers of these letters here are Christians, and that's why I got so very excited about this, because I'm a sociolinguist by training, so I get very, very interested in the linguistic differences between the different communities when they write, when they speak. And there aren't really any other Christian corpora, at least published or available to me, so that's why I was very, very excited about this. But it's not just Christians that are being mentioned, they are part of a very multi-faith network. There are letters to Muslims and letters to Jews, so it really gives this really nice impression of this network, this mercantile network that we had active in 1759. And of course these networks aren't new in the 18th century, they had been in place for many hundreds of years. There has been a really long ebb and flow of mercantile activity, in particular in Egypt and in sort of what is now the Holy Land, Lebanon and Syria. And this started in the 11th century with these big networks that were operating out of Egypt under the Fatimids. They were really dominating the Mediterranean trade. And then it changed slightly in the 12th century. The Italian city-states started really pushing into mercantile activities, and sort of the Egyptians had to withdraw that. They were then sort of trading towards the southern east, towards Yemen and towards India, while the Italians became very dominant. Genoese, Venetians. I mean, you probably. Yes, so the latter power, you will know these, you will know this, someone just showed around the book of Istanbul, this is the Galata Tower in Istanbul, and these presences, the Italian presences that were established everywhere. So most of the letters will look like this one here, but there are also others which look, if you know Arabic, which look a bit more crude. And I don't think it's necessarily crude writing. I think there's actually some interference in letters like this. There are quite a few that look like this. And I think that there's a bit of Syriac influence there. Those are people who grow up to write Syriac first, and then they become Arabic writing. And this is something that I know from the Geniza very well, because in our Geniza sources we learn that pretty much every male Jewish boy in the 11th century, for example, would have been taught to read. So we have a literacy rate that's exorbitantly high, 95% of all boys. And even girls were educated, we know that, because we have the community records where orphan girls have their school fees paid for by the community. So we know that learning at least to read is something that's really prized. And we know that similar things happened in other minority communities, such as Christian Syriac communities. So I talked to someone who works on this, and he basically told me that the processes are exactly the same as in the Jewish community. So in the Jewish community, you would learn to read first Hebrew and Hebrew script, then you would learn to read Arabic in Hebrew script, and in the end, you would learn how to read Arabic in Arabic script. And apparently, it's the same in Syriac. You first learn Syriac in Syriac script, then Arabic in Syriac script, and in the end, Arabic in Arabic script. So when you have a product like this could well be the product of an education system where you basically learn a different alphabet in a different language first, and then you switch to another. And that's also, you can see this in some of the linguistic features, because there's definitely a Syrian influence or Levant influence in the Arabic. So as I said, we have two different kinds of correspondence. We have traders' letters, we have all sorts of correspondence that pertain to mercantile activity, including registers, ship registers. But we also have other letters. We have letters that are sent by clergy in Rome to co-religionists in Egypt and in Levant. And these letters mostly deal with a relay of information between the different churches, or they deal with sort of mercantile letters in a clerical context, so dealing with books, dealing with icons and pictures and things like that. And the letters also show this very close connection between the traders and the clergymen. they really, really trust one another. So in one of the letters, a priest called Raphael, and I'll talk about Raphael in a second, he makes it really clear that he trusts one of the main traders we have. We have about 15 letters by a certain guy called Joseph Bhakti. And he really talks about how he trusts this guy and that all the correspondence should be sent via this particular trader because he's a very trustworthy merchant. Because from the hands of those mentioned, we have received many letters safely, and they were sent to us whatever you give to them. So there's a real trust between the clergy and those merchants. And this is something that is expressed in many letters. So, as I already said, the price papers are really, really exciting on many, many levels. Both historical, linguistic, but also material culture. So from a linguistic point of view, the fact that there's very, very little other comparative material available makes them a really, really precious source. They really fill our gap of understanding of how Christians in the period would write and how they would sort of frame the linguistic continuum of their own networks. The historical importance is that they enable us really to gain very precious insights into the interaction between the different merchants and different faith communities across the borders. So from Egypt to the Levant and then also into Italy. And we also learn about the relations between the different sort of Christian institutions around the Mediterranean. And the material aspect, the material culture aspect is, as I already said, the fact that we actually have completely closed letters, which is something extremely precious, because normally when we have archival materials, the letters are obviously open. No one bothers to keep an envelope in an archive. So this was working on the price papers was the first time I actually had a proper letter in my hand, and I could see how it's folded and I could see how it's sealed, which was something that was completely obscure to me before, because I've always just worked on big letters, opened letters that had been handled and then had been filed somewhere. So this was really revelatory. Just checking time, so I know I don't go on too long. So coming back to historical content, I've talked about the mercantile correspondence, but I also want to explain a little bit more about the background of the clerical materials. And this is heavily borrowed from the work of Alberto Winterberg, I'm going to say. So the Coptic Church emerged in the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon, which was this big split between the different churches. And the split was also due to the fact that there are two different factions in theological doctrine. So you have the Monophysites, which are the Coptic churches believe that there is only one Christ, one single human divine nature person, whereas the Diophysites, which are Romans and the Byzantines, they define Christ as a being in possession of two human and divine nature. So this caused a really, really big split between the churches. It caused basically a presence of two churches in Egypt, because the Byzantines introduced the Greek Orthodox Church in Egypt, the Diophysite Church, as opposed to the Church of the Monophysite Coptics. And there was struggle between the two churches until the Arabs invaded Egypt and basically pushed the momentum towards the Copts, because the Greek Church was associated with Byzantium, which was a political enemy. So, by the 17th century, there was a bit of a dawn of a new policy in Rome towards dealing with Christians in the East. I mean, this sort of early colonialism, early expansionism. And they started to begin to establish themselves as a presence in Egypt. And they started to focus on conversion of Egyptian Christians rather than unification of the Copts. And to do this, they basically tried to find suitable candidates who would come from Egypt to Rome, to give them in Rome a doctrinal education and missionary training. And this would happen at the newly established Collegio Urbano. And it was actually not easy for people to find candidates because there were very, very few people who were willing to actually make this move from Egypt to Europe. As sort of what Hamilton says, that there was a profound sense of family feeling which characterized Egyptian society, which would have prevented them from leaving the family. Coptic parents hoped that their children would offer them in old age, so if you let your children go, of course you would lose someone to provide for you in old age. And there was also this really sort of deep reluctance to let your children move across the sea. I mean, this is something that's shared in many cultures. I know that, for example, in India, people who crossed the sea lost their caste, right? They lost their caste belonging, because it was something that was just not done if you crossed the ocean. But they found some people who were willing to come to Italy and to be trained as priests. And one of them was this priest Raphael, or not a priest then, but this boy Raphael, who was a bit of a rebellious person. He was born in 1700 in the upper Egyptian town of Girga. And there are really, really nice descriptions of him in various historians. He's quite a famous person. And again, in this amazing twist, these few prize papers we have from this random ship actually contain letters of this Raphael too, who was quite a famous Coptic person. And again, this is not something that is unique to the prize papers. We have a very similar thing in the Geniza, where you really find the writings of the celebrities of the time. So, for example, the Geniza contains the original works, many of the originals of the famous Maimonides. So we have letters by Maimonides, but we also have all sorts of treatises. We have medical works by Maimonides, and similarly we have works of the famous Judah Halevi. So somehow famous people's works, even at the time, managed to find their ways into the archive. But of course, in the case of the prize papers, it's even more astonishing because we have this random lot, and then one of the people in this random lot is actually quite a famous Coptic person who's a priest. Who was consecrated as a priest in Rome in 1735. He dedicated his life to being a scholar. He was the first Egyptian to receive a doctoral degree of theology in Rome. And then he basically was even ordained as a bishop by Pope Clement XIII in 1761. He died in Rome in 87, so he lived a very long life, and he was buried at the Vatican. So we have this extraordinary person basically featuring in our letters. I was talking about material culture earlier. This is also something really, really nice in the prize papers. We actually have a sample of ware. So this person here writes, can you please send me more of this sort of copper wire? And then he sends exactly what sort of copper wire he has. He would like to have, so he sends the sample here as a demand to his partner, which is just extraordinary. So look at the time again. I have about 10 minutes. Okay. So I thought maybe at the end I'll, so this is Raphael Tupri, this is one of his letters that he wrote. He has very, very neat handwriting, so even if you like me, you're not that good in reading Arabic, sort of difficult handwriting, this is something that even I can very easily read. So he's my favorite, he's a good boy. So perhaps I thought, in the minutes left, we could delve into some of the very interesting aspects that are highlighted in the letters. And again, I want to refer some of it to beneath the materials. So what becomes quite apparent is that people here are not necessarily writing themselves, but they're using scribes. The signature here that is below is a different person signing it, sending greetings, sending his name, than the person writing the letter. And this is a very, very common phenomenon in the Geniza and for mercantile activities at the time, because often you try to send copies of letters in 5 different ships, so not one person could write very quickly. You have to react quickly. You couldn't write long letters like this in 5 copies all by yourself. Also, there's something about using a scribe. Higher merchants would not write themselves. Obviously, it's something that you do, let someone do who is your inferior. And this is shared sort of shared heritage all over the Eastern Mediterranean. these are very, very nice copies we have in the Geniza of a letter that was written by a community leader, by a Jewish community leader. It's a Judeo-Arabic letter. And then on the left side you have the slightly nicer copy of a scribe. And the scribe basically removes all spelling mistakes and grammatical mistakes. And he also removes some sort of angry comments that are in the original letter. So it's sort of the smooth copy, which is much nicer, which again tells you, even documents can't necessarily be trusted. So the original is the one on the right, where the person really has a go at someone, and then the nice sort of nicened up copy is the one on the left by the scribe. But the scribe is the one who sets the linguistic standards as well. The one on the right is the one who writes that what we wouldn't call proper English. A very, very common theme that we find in the letter is. And it's also very common in all letters of Arabic, especially Geniza letters, is the complaint about the lack of letters and the complaint about the lack of affection. So we have this one very nice letter where it said, in particular, you sent me your news to the monastery, in particular, as you sent your news to the monastery of our father Pachomius, and the thought never entered your minds to update us with your news, as if you had forgotten about us entirely. And as if the love between us had been lost in this way. So that with all effort and hard work possible for me, I was not able to restore it again. Not only that, but I cannot even see one carat of the love and friendship that I used to enjoy. Indeed, that is not expected between friends. Without saying more, you're able to judge the situation better than me. Thus now you should think about everything that happened. I do not want to ask you about the reason for this loss and the delay for your reply. It's very, very heartfelt complaints about not receiving information sent to other people of the same world, but not to him. But there's also often self-criticism. Here, this person, another writer, apologizes for not using quite the right style. He says, you informed us that we are always sending to you harsh letters and rude words. You did not want to reply to us with cruel letters. This is, our brothers, indeed a grace from you that you didn't reply. Indeed, I do remember which bitter words I wrote to you because I was angry. From now onwards, I will not send you rude words ever again. What you think is appropriate, do it. You should be responsible for your business as I am for mine. The misfortune and the loss is on us. In any case, we keep on pursuing our profit. Very, very important theme in the letters. And then there's another letter which is really, really quite interesting because the information they are sort of given there reveals so much about the background of how young people from Egypt would be sent to Italy to be trained and in the mercantile activity. There's a particular person who sent his son, so the person to whom the letter is addressed sent his son to Italy, and things didn't go very well. So he is sent this letter concerning your son Ibrahim. We are treating him with mercy and are making efforts in what helps his soul and his body for the sake of the family and for yourselves. We are acting patiently as much as we can. We're telling ourselves when he makes a mistake, it's not a problem, because he's still a young boy and he does not understand. Gradually he will get used to grasp this and he will understand his mistakes and come to understand. However, what we see is that his heart is passionate and the arrogance and self-conceit are in his blood. This attribute comes from his mother's side, the mother is Egyptian. It will never change. He makes me miserable. How many times I ordered him to stop this? He can only take leave when I know where he's going and with whom, according to the mandatory rules. But this did not work with him, because of his arrogance and his lack of humility. If I let it happen once, he will do it 10 times, and 10 times will become 100 times. Especially in this country, which is a free country. So there's a real complaint about Italy and Italian youth in there. My intention is that I'm exhausted with the kid because of his lack of obedience. We find that his case is hopeless because God dislikes the arrogant. My effort to guide him are worthless, and the Egyptian descendants have no worth and they are hopeless. So there's a bit of a turn. In the beginning there's some hope in the text, so he says, you know, he will get used to this, but in the end, he sort of talks himself into a rage, and he gets very, very upset. Okay. I think I have maybe. Very quickly, there's also a lot of talk about the trade of books and of manuscripts. So we hear about Coptic books that are being sent, sort of nice manuscripts are being sent from the Middle East to Italy, and then sort of they sent back printed books, which doesn't sound like a terrible good trade in modern eyes, but probably was a trade that worked both ways at the time. And we also hear about illness. We hear about how someone with kidney stone, who probably has a kidney stone, is being sent to Italy for treatment, and they're basically sort of treating him in all sorts of ways to make him better. So we have a health tourism in the Mediterranean. And I think I want to wrap this up by talking a little bit about my own field, which is sociolinguistics. And I don't think we have too many Arabic people here, so Arabic people, so speaking or Arabic writing people. So I'll just keep it very, very general. What's really intriguing about the letters is that Christians use much more colloquial language when they write to their fellow Christians than when they write to Muslims. So just to demonstrate this, in yellow basically is the marking of vernacular language. When you see a Christian to a Muslim, writing to a Muslim, these vernacular elements are kept to a minimum, but when a Christian writes to a Christian, it's much, much more colloquial. And the reason for that is that there is a community feeling, right? People, when they write to fellow Christians, they will use a language which is much, much more warm and hence vernacular. So that's something that is one of the big results in terms of linguistics. Writers start to write more colloquial language when they get angry, which is very, very nice. So they will basically express sort of an angry statement will often have much more colloquial elements in it. I will not read this, but in case some of you can read Arabic, you can see the colloquial elements in this. Because this person is quite angry because he doesn't know whether he's making a loss or a profit. And the third thing is that clerics would write in a different register than merchants. I mean, it's something that is expected, but the way they do it is quite interesting because they actually almost invent a new sort of language for themselves, which sounds elevated, but it's actually not what would be called elevated language in other contexts. So those of you who know Arabic, they can probably see that there are some really interesting forms in there. Right, so yes, just to wrap up now, I hope that I've given you a good introduction to the Price Paper Collection, to show you that it's really a unique opportunity to study documentary Christian Ottoman Arabic. They open up a wealth of material historically, linguistically, and also material culture sort of understanding. And yes, if you have any questions, and I'm very Germanic, so I timed this exactly.